Single page apps. All right, I'm going to talk about a few things here. First is routes. Second is pages. Third is loading and persisting data. And fourth is module structure. Okay, this is the third of three sections by process of elimination in which we're immediately going to go to the code and poke around in it. All right, let's take a look. So we're going to start with talking about routes. So routes essentially are the conceptual idea of what is our URL space. We've got all these URLs that we potentially do or do not handle, and URLs each map to a particular route. Now, we have a few routes that look sort of familiar. We've got home, I'll get to root in a second, log in, log out, register, settings, article. Notice that the article route is parameterized on a slug, so you can't be on a particular viewing an article page unless you also have a slug which identifies which article we're viewing. You have a profile, which has a username that corresponds to it. In other words, whose profile are we viewing? We have new article and edit article, which are a little bit different in that edit article has a slug associated with it and new article does not. Under the hood, these map to a single page, which we've been editing throughout the day. But as we will see later, pages and routes are slightly different concepts. So this is our route, and it sort of determines, logically speaking, what are we doing right now? Like what are we on at this exact moment? These are the ones that we care about. If the URL is something that does not map to one of these, then that's going to be an error state. That's something we just don't have a concept of in our application. We do have what's known as a parser. So this is a URL parser. It comes from the URL parsing library, the Elm URL package. And it's got a couple of handy things in here if you haven't seen these before. So this is basically an infix operator that's used for a DSL for specifying URL strings. And then it's got a couple of different combinators here, parser, one of, s, and string, which we'll look at in a moment. So here's how we write a URL parser that maps URL strings directly to these routes. So we start off with parser.oneOf, which is basically going to say, run each of these in order, and the first one that succeeds, that's what we're going to use. Just stop going through the list, we'll just disregard the others. So first we have parser.maphome to parser.top, which essentially says, if we get empty URL, we're just at the top of our hierarchy with nothing else on top. Totally great, then we're going to just succeed with home. Then we have login, which is /login, logout, which is /logout, settings, profile, register, etc. We can see the little slash infix operator here, which is basically saying when we have a profile here, which is to say one of these, that's going to have two pieces to it. First, it's going to have /profile, and then it's going to have the result of a username.url parser. So it's going to look for a profile, and then it's going to parse whatever comes after the slash after profile as a username, and it's going to put both of those into this profile right here. Okay, so using this, we have this sort of concise DSL to show these mappings between URLs of various shapes and sizes, in some cases with extra slashes and strings and so forth, and they're mapping to routes. Worth noting that sometimes we have routes that do a different route depending on whether the URL does or does not have a slash after it. So for example, we have parser.map new article. This is the case where we have just the editor and we don't have a slash after it, followed by the case where we do have an editor followed by a slash, and then we do the slug.url parser. As previously noted, good module organization strategies for Elm typically are each module revolves around a particular type. So this is the route module, and it has a couple of different functions here. Notice, incidentally, that we don't actually expose that parser directly. We use it as a helper to something else, namely the fromURL function. So this says, give me a URL, and I may or may not give you back a route. Now this is a little bit of extra logic in here that has to do with the fact that the real-world spec doesn't deal in terms of actual the URLs with like slashes in them directly. Rather, it does it sort of builds an extra layer on top of them based on the hash. So if you look in here, you notice that we're not actually on the root here. We're on localhost port 3000 /pound. And if I go to new post, we're actually going to #/editor. If I go to settings, it's #/settings. Essentially, I wanted to work as though we were not dealing in those terms. So what I did is I essentially wrote a little helper here that says, I'm going to actually take the fragment and pretend that's our actual path, and then use that and then parse as normal as though it were a regular path. So this is sort of a little extra step that I took to make sure that it sort of feels like using the path, because that's really what they're going for with this spec. They want the hash routing for various reasons, but I wanted to sort of pretend that it's a path, because that's what it most closely resembles by design. Okay, so that's how we go from a URL to a route. And it's a maybe route because, again, it could maybe not map to any of these. If this one of fails and we go through all of our known routes and we don't see it, then it's like, yeah, I'm just going to give you back nothing because that URL that you're visiting does not map to any of these routes that we know about. And ultimately, that's what's going to lead some other logic to render a page not found. Okay, so that's how we go from URL to a route. What's arguably more useful is the other way around, is this route to string function. Now what this does is it takes a route and returns a string. And essentially what it does is it uses this URL builder, the string.join to build the URL with the hash in front of it. And essentially I am making this my single source of truth for how to generate links throughout the application. So anywhere I want to put a link, I'm not going to call like href directly. What I'm going to use instead is this little helper we have here called route.href. And route.href doesn't take a string, it takes a route and gives you back an attribute. So throughout the application, this is what we're using whenever we want to link to something. So rather than linking to a hard-coded string, which could potentially get out of sync, could potentially get a typo in it, we're instead passing it one of these custom type values, such that if we're ever giving it an invalid route, it just won't compile. Not only that, but we're also always, because we're passing it a route, forced to specify not only this is an article, but also this article has to have a slug associated with it. We can't forget that or else it won't compile. So having this route type actually helps us out in two ways. It helps us when parsing URLs because it gives us a way to map to the route and say, okay, this is actually part of the set of things that we recognize as valid URLs. And it also helps us go the other way around and to say when you want to get a URL to something, just work only in terms of the route and leave all of the URL specific logic inside this module. So actually outside of this route module, none of the rest of the application should have any business dealing with URLs directly. It should all be in terms of routes for them. So essentially, route is an abstraction on top of valid URLs, URLs that we actually know how to work with in our application. Now granted, there are not guarantees around this. So it's encouraged to use routes.href, but the plain HTML href still exists. If pages want to, they can continue to use hard-coded strings. If we wanted to actually rule that out, we could do something like what Tessa did and make sort of a drop-in replacement for HTML, which includes the route module inside of it, and then also drop-in replacements for all the HTML functions except for that one. But that seemed like overkill. So instead, it's just something that is encouraged, but which there's an escape hatch if people want to use the other thing. Hopefully, we could train our team if I had a team of people working on this code base to use route. And when we do it at work, this is basically how we do it.